The C64, the old camel lozenge, the khaki calculator, a big hitter of 80s computer gaming, but 3D maybe wasn't its strong point. This though didn't stop a few brave developers from giving it a good go, it being an era when wild, hopeful invention often paid dividends. Sprite-based gaming was what the C64 was made for. 3D, well, that didn't come quite so easily. So join me as I take a quick meander through a few, not a definitive list, but a few games that showed what the Brown Thunder could do when that extra dimension really pushed it hard. And to begin, what else could it be but Elite? This jaunty theme music was sadly unique to the German release, a pleasant but slightly incongruous intro to this epic space adventure. Yes, a game that was designed from the beginning to blow the doors off 8-bit micros and tear open the horizons of a whole generation of players. A game on a vast scale that more or less invented the whole non-linear, open-ended, open-world style of gaming. The C64 version of Elite is perhaps not the absolute best, but it's still pretty darn good. This was a game that turned out well on every platform it was ported to, and the C64 is no exception. Perhaps a surprise though, because it's here that we've got to face this system's biggest obstacle to 3D, its rather weak CPU. Yes, the MOS 6510 that powers the C64 is quite a bit slower than those running the show in many other 8-bit systems, the PAL version being unable to summon up even a full megahertz, just under half the speed of the otherwise near identical CPU that powers the BBC Micro, where this game of course made its celebrated debut. Given that, you might expect this version to be a bit lacking, but it really isn't. Compared side by side with the BBC version, you can see a difference. It is maybe a touch slower, a bit more flickery possibly, but by itself, it doesn't really feel like you're missing out on that much at all. Not bad when you consider we're dealing with a machine with basically half the number crunching power. I suppose there isn't much that I can say about Elite that hasn't already been said, a game whose position in gaming history is not in any doubt. But I will say that whilst there are plenty of games from 1984 that are good for a quick blast, there really aren't many that I could see myself sinking much time into. But Elite is an engrossing exception. It shows its age in so many ways. That docking sequence is still a very brutal introduction to spacefaring, a learning curve a bit steeper than what we're used to today. But I could still probably get lost in Elite, and the C64 version wouldn't be a bad way of doing it. Moving on as we must do, I feel a random swerve into strange new territory coming on. An entirely different kind of 3D game, one that's maybe not quite as celebrated as Elite, but just as ambitious in its own way. From 1986, it's the Sentinel. A game that defies easy categorization, a sort of strategic puzzle game that seems to inhabit its own micro-genre. If some dark alien force was attempting to recruit the minds of the nation's youth through video games back then, well, this is probably what it would look like. A surreal 80s sci-fi fever dream. A truly odd mix of 3D chess, hide and seek, and King of the Castle, set across a series of stark procedurally generated digital landscapes. At the time groundbreaking, and still today unique. What's going on here? Well, I'm going to struggle to describe all its weird and brain-jarring complexity. The aim of the game is basically though to gain height until you reach the point where you can overlook each level's fearsome guardian, the Sentinel, allowing you to absorb it and move on to the next world. Sounds confusing? Well, yes it is. This is a game you're going to have to experience for yourself to really understand what's going on, and even then, it might take a while. Another one that started out life on the BBC Micro, but again the C64 version was not a disappointment. To be expected really, ported as it was by original developer Jeff Crammond. Yes, a tad slower than the BBC, the C64's CPU the culprit once again, no doubt. But thanks to the Commodore's more naturalistic colour palette, it probably looks a bit nicer and still plays very well. A game that was cleverly designed to get the very best out of 8-bit hardware. All the limitations of the game engine seem to have been marshalled into features. Even if this game were remade today, I can't imagine you'd change all that much. Switching viewpoints can take a few seconds, and scrolling around the rendered landscape does come with some hitches. But well, it doesn't really ruin the experience. With 10,000 levels to go at, this could take a while to get through, though if you do complete it, I understand you will get the opportunity to commune with interdimensional beings, though the exciting employment opportunity they were recruiting for may well now have passed 30 odd years on. So to move on once again, a game based around entirely earthly forces, released in 1987, it's Project Stealth Fighter from Microprose. A company that were known for their serious simulations, and this is exactly that, a sophisticated combat flight game that went in hard and heavy on the detail. Resolutely not an accessible arcade shooter, just about every key on the keyboard seems to have some function, from raising the landing gear to opening the bomb bay. Great if you're into that sort of thing. Yes, this is a game you're going to need the manual and a fair amount of patience to get the best out of. One for the more methodical military enthusiast, a bit of a stretch for wild button mashers like myself, but excitement it has for those with the right frame of mind. Okay, the graphics may look like a handful of mangled pipe cleaners on a snooker table, and you could probably model them yourself in that medium as quickly as the C64 can. Still though, it's amazing just how much has been crammed in here. A variety of missions set across 4 areas with bombing runs, dogfighting, reconnaissance, yes, a whole Cold War era aerial combat kaleidoscope. Looking back at it today, it can feel like it may all be a bit too much for the old magic dung heap to handle. It's just so achingly slow. But this game received rave reviews on its release, and I can see why. A game that brought about as much authenticity and depth as you could hope to see on a system like this. A game that didn't stand alone in its field, but was about the best example of its type at the time on the C64. Certainly it meets the criteria of a game that pushed the limits, such a full-featured flight simulator running on such a modest machine. A lot done with a little. Now I think it's time to visit the work of Jeff Crammond once again, another C64 game with his name on the box, and once again both limit pushing and innovative. Released in 1989, it's Stunk Eraser. Now, if Mr. Crammond had been under the influence of dark forces in the creation of the Sentinel, he seemed to have shaken it off by the time he created this. A light-hearted 3D racer with crazy physics and outlandish tracks. Far from a simulator, but still an absorbing experience. A cross-platform game, these 16-bit versions were really the top tier, but it made a good turnout on everything it was ported to. Of the 3 official 8-bit versions, the C64 is fairly easily the best though, both in looks and gameplay. Again, perhaps a surprise given the C64's processing power, or lack of it. Even the ZX Spectrum was a good bit faster on the CPU front, but here it easily takes the lead. Clearly Jeff knew what he was doing, because this doesn't feel like much of a downgrade. All the features of the Amiga and ST versions appear to be here, all the tracks and even the local networked multiplayer. But best of all, it's still reasonably fast, reasonably smooth, and keeps the needle on the gameometer buried in the fun end of the dial. Yes, the already abstract graphics are even more abstract here. The draw distance would make even an N64 developer blush, but still mightily impressive on a machine that has no more than an eighth of the power of those big 16-bitters. Easily the best 3D racer on the C64, but that isn't saying much given the lack of them. Not many developers were even willing to give it a try, but fortune favours the brave, and this was a brave game that worked well. As the 80s turned to the 90s, things had definitely moved on in the world of gaming. 8-bit machines were struggling to keep up, but the C64 had a bit more to give than most, managing to hang on for another few years with some great releases like Turrican 2 and Mayhem in Monsterland. This game, released in 1990, is probably just as impressive as those beloved latecomers, but not nearly so well known, it would seem. A major cross-platform release from a fairly major company. It's Space Rogue. Okay, the intro doesn't bode that well, but the rest of the game really picks up quickly. An open world 3D spacefaring combat trading simulation pitting you, a plucky lone captain, against... Alright, it does sound an awful lot like Elite, and well, to be absolutely honest, it is sort of an Elite clone. But this is Elite with a bit extra added, created by Origin Systems, yes, those guys of Ultima and Wing Commander fame. This is Elite meets RPG. Elite with cutscenes, with a narrative, Elite where you can get out of your spaceship and interrogate NPCs about their backstory. Some of these additions may be welcome, some not, but it is a complete experience. Yes, this is a disc-only game, maybe going some way to explaining its lack of popularity back here in Tapeland, but it clearly benefits from having more storage space, giving it more content and a more graphically expansive world. The main event though still has to be the 3D sections, and don't they look good, easily surpassing the original Elite in this regard. The filled polygons are, given the limitations we're dealing with, amazingly smooth. Yes, it looks better than any polygonal 3D C64 game that I can think of. It plays very well too, the controls being surprisingly intuitive. A mixture of joystick and keyboard gives you a much better grip on 3D space than most other games of this type. Still tricky, but also satisfying. Like Elite, you'll still be dealing with docking, but it is rather more cheerfully forgiving, both because of the control system and, I suspect, because it's a bit looser on the collision detection. Though what Origin gives with one hand, it takes away with the other, because the wormhole sequences are a bit of a nightmare, long and torturous, though mercifully not usually fatal. Is this a better game than Elite? Well, from a historical perspective, no. It's more of a follower than a leader, but still a seriously impressive one. Viewing it as a sort of unofficial sequel to Elite, something that 8-bit machines never saw, it has a lot to offer. I can't say why, but this really doesn't seem to be that well known. There's not even currently a complete walkthrough here on YouTube, something usually even the most obscure C64 titles can boast. Even an official re-release of the DOS version doesn't seem to have raised its profile all that much. A game with a lot of polish, unsurprising given the big budget developer, rather more fleshed out than what you'd expect from an 8-bit system, and definitely one that pushed the limits. Now, as the end approaches, where else can we go? Surely the old silicon slurry pit has shown us all it's got. Well, no, not quite. The C64 is the gift that keeps on giving, a system where the releases, in one form or another, never dried up. Yes, now we look a little beyond the C64's commercial life and into something that emerged from the demo scene. A maybe unexpected addition to the C64's library, its mood. The pun may be obvious, I think you can tell where the inspiration for this one came from. Yes, you might call it an ambitious project. A moving target too, a game that has had several releases over the years, never quite finished, but impressive right from the start. The original release in 1996 was a definite stunner, a genuine first-person shooter running like a dream on the stock, unexpanded C64, and it only got better from there. The latest release from 2006 is smoother than ever and really very playable, complete with multiple weapons, a map screen, redefinable controls. You can even strafe if you really want to go for that old school flex. demo sceners certainly know how to get the best out of the C64, and here the crew No Name show us they've really got the skills. These sorts of games were never going to work all that well on those old 8-bit machines. Even most of the next gen 16-bit systems struggled to give us anything like a playable version of Doom, so to see this running like it does, well, it barely seems possible. Now, a harsh critic might note that the graphics are a little bit indistinct at times, a little bit low res, like an Atari 2600 throwing up when it gets busy, and I suppose it's a bit more Wolfenstein than Doom in the gameplay if we really want to pick holes. Yes, it's got its limitations, but that frame rate is never sacrificed. It bounces along like a gazelle, in fact. To anyone who struggled through Doom on a lower end 386, it might even seem like a bit of an upgrade. Yes, the C64 pushed hard here certainly, but not so far that it stops being fun to play. No news on this since 2006, and I've no idea if we'll ever see it finished. You'd think they'd done the hard part really, but it does remain sadly incomplete. Give it a title screen, add some more maps, smear some Vaseline over the screen, maybe, if you really want to dream, add some multiplayer, and this could be a masterpiece. Now, I think it is time to slink off to the end of your patience possibly. Thanks for watching if you've got this far, but not the end of what the C64 has to offer in 3D by a long way. Yes, it turns out that there are way more 3D C64 games than I ever remember there being. A lot of really good ones too. Though I'm absolutely sure that everyone watching this video will agree unanimously that I've picked exactly the right titles for this list and I'm completely not an idiot. Well, on the off chance you do think there's anything I've left out, well, let me know in the comments below. And I'll see you next time.